Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 197. Show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/197. And y'all know that the show is also featured at the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick is where you can find my archives there. This is going to be a really interesting episode, I think. I'm going to be doing a little bit of maybe an urban legend kind of exploring type thing, but I'm going to be talking about my hometown. And I'm not going to dox myself. I don't currently live here, but I did grow up in this town, and there were a few things about this town that were old, because, the town is Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin, and it's a very old town. It has an old history. There's a lot of really interesting artifacts that are there and interesting buildings that are still up there in town. And one of them is the Leinenkugel's Lodge. If you ever enjoyed beer, Leinenkugel's beer. Summer Shandy is like the most famous, popular one right now. It's the beer that's mixed with lemonade. And until recently, they had the Indian head logo that was very iconic, Leinenkugel's. You probably heard of it. I think it's distributed nationally. But there's other things like the Rutledge Mansion, and there's a dam situated there on the river. I'm actually going to, for those of you watching the video version, I'm just going to put up the Google Maps of it here. And there's kind of it's an iconic place. I mean, you come down the bridge and you see the river and you see this iconic dam here, the NSP Dam, and you come down through town. And there's the brewery that you can go. It's called the Leine Lodge now, but you can go here. And you see the old brewery, the original brewery from the 1800s. You can still go there, and that's where they brew all the specialty beer. So there's that. There's the Heidi Center for the Arts, which is an old building that's situated right here on the East Hill. And basically what Chippewa Falls was a big logging hub. And you can see there was the dam here, and there was a line of old buildings here. And the Sheely House is what's left of what used to be a row of buildings here, kind of downtown. And there's the Mason Shoe Factory, which is the company that made all the boots for the loggers. And so there's just a very storied history in Chippewa Falls. And growing up, there was always one thing that I wondered about, because there was this facility that was placed over here kind of by the lake is. And trivia fact about the Lake Wissota, it's mentioned in the Titanic. And Jack Dawson says, oh, yeah, well, he's talking to Rose, trying to talk her off the bottom of the back of the ship because she's about to commit suicide. And he's talking about how cold the water is. And he says, oh, I grew up in Wisconsin during the winter, and we would go ice fishing on Lake Wissota in Chippewa Falls. And I fell through the ice. And it's a big plot point in the movie where he's talking about it. Well, the Lake Wissota wasn't actually in existence when the Titanic sank. It was a man-made lake that was made after. So that's kind of like a claim to fame, is that Jack Dawson gets history wrong. One of the script writers in Titanic got the history wrong. But what's really interesting is because if you look at it, I always wondered, because when I would ride the school bus to middle school, we always came on this County Highway J here. And as you were driving past, there was this facility that we would always drive past. And you would drive past this facility and always really kind of wonder what it was. And I'll go to the street view. But you were going through, and first off, there was this building over here that looked kind of old. And if you guys should probably be watching the video version of this, because there will be a lot of visuals here. My understanding was that this was a jail for prisoners. It's called the Chippewa Valley Correctional Treatment Facility, but I understood it as kind of like a jail type facility for inpatient treatment or prisoners who got old and required special care. But there was always this campus here And we would ride past it in the school bus, and I always kind of look and see, wondering what the hell was over there, because there were these old buildings there, and it looked kind of like you see here, kind of like an institution, like a mental hospital or something like that. And I don't remember ever learning about it. We would do things in class talking about history and the Civil War, because Chippewa Falls has a storied history where some of the original Iron Brigade soldiers were from Chippewa Falls, and they would always be honored like old Abe the War Eagle type thing. So growing up, I never visited this area here, never explored the campus or anything else. And as I became a libertarian and as I started listening to James Corbett, I learned more and more about the history of eugenics. And it was something that I didn't really learn about too much growing up, didn't know much about. And interestingly enough, it was episode 14 of the podcast where myself and my original co-host, Jerry, talked about eugenics, and the eugenics of the minimum wage is the name of the episode. And we kind of explored this idea because, and that's how James Corbett actually, I became contacted with him, because he somehow found that episode and thought that it was really interesting. And so kind of reached out, and that's where that contact came from. But come to kind of find out later, even after we did that episode, I didn't really think about this much until I was doing some more research and found out that Wisconsin was actually one of the states in the United States that was at the tip of the spear intellectually with the eugenics movement. And I was actually kind of, because Wisconsin does have a progressive history, especially the university, like University of Wisconsin at UW-Madison. And so you have these progressive thinkers that take a foothold there. And I was always proud of Wisconsin, because Wisconsin famously nullified the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1800s. And there was a famous Supreme Court case, Wisconsin Supreme Court case, talking about that. But come to find out that Wisconsin is very much related to this history of eugenics. And so I checked out, there was this book I was reading a little while ago, a few years ago, called Illiberal Reformers by Thomas C. Leonard. And it's a really good book. Although Thomas C. Leonard, he doesn't really put together the fact that the progressive ideology, even as it stands today, is still intimately tied to these ideas. He does a really good job talking about where progressivism in the administrative state comes from. And I titled this episode Eugenics in Wisconsin, or something like that. I haven't made up the title yet. But I wanted to track through, because I was running my wife and kids to Minneapolis for Christmas. And on my way back, it was nighttime, and I decided to go explore, because I had explored this facility in the past, and it's all public, like the roads, they're all publicly accessible. So you can go in there, even though certain areas are roped off. But this is called the Northern Center. And in the past, this facility was called, what's currently called the Northern Center for the Developmentally Disabled. But it used to be called the Wisconsin Center for the Feebleminded. And I might be, let's see. So let's just put up on the screen here, I have just the Wisconsin Historical Marker Database. And this is the entry for this facility. And it says Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled, because it's still currently active. And I want to be very clear that, of course, well, as it is now, they actually still take people who are developmentally disabled, who have profound disabilities, and they take care of them there. And there's, in no way am I saying that the facility as it currently is condones any of this. This is just the history of the facility. And so the facility as it is, as far as I understand, is upstanding and taking care of their clients. That's not what I'm trying to say here, that they're untoward in any way. But this is the history of the facility. So I'm reading here from this entry. Before the entry says, before the 19th century social reform movement, developmentally disabled people were relegated to almshouses and county poor farms, where the, quote, indigent, insane, epileptic, and idiotic were housed together without regard to individual condition. Reformists advocated more humane treatment of the socially dependent, and by the mid-19th century had demonstrated the educability of the, quote, mentally deficient and opened homes for their care and training. In 1895, Wisconsin allocated $100,000 for the establishment of its first institution for the developmentally disabled. Located in Chippewa Falls on 600 acres of land offered by the city, the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded opened June 17, 1897. The home, renamed the Northern Wisconsin Colony and Training School in 1923, provided care for children and adults and taught skills in self-care, farming, housekeeping, arts and crafts, and academics. In the 1970s, a new emphasis was placed on community care of the developmentally disabled, and the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled, renamed in 1976, began providing outreach services to individuals and communities. And so in 1996, this was added, the Wisconsin Historical Society marker was added. So very interesting, and it's not something that we learned a whole lot about. I don't know if it's because it's not something that you want to be particularly proud of, because there were eugenic sterilizations that took place at this facility, and that's what we're going to be exploring in a bit of depth here. So first, I kind of wanted to outline what the background is of eugenics in Wisconsin. So one of the most famous people kind of at the heart of this was Richard T. Ely, and it might be Ely or Ellie. But in Illiberal Reformers on page 12, Thomas Leonard writes this: the American Economic Association, AEA, founded in 1885, embodied the social gospel's distinctive amalgam of liberal Protestant ethics, veneration of science, and the evangelizing activism of pious middle-class reformers. And so in the early beginning of this book, he's talking about the progressive reformers, this evangelic kind of activist mindset, and how it was tied to religion. And I think there's obvious parallels with COVID-19 and the way basically replacing God with science, and of course the state being the entity that administers that science. But I digress. So clergyman Josiah Strong, 1847 to 1916, author of the best-selling Our Country, An Exaltation of Protestant Anglo-Saxon Manifest Destiny, praised the AEA for its Christian political economy. Of the AEA's 55 charter members, 23 were clergymen, many of them national leaders of the social gospel movement, including Washington Gladden and Lyman Abbott. Richard T. Ely, the prime mover behind the AEA's establishment, exemplified the social gospel of economic reform. The good Christian should be concerned with this world, Ely said, not with the next. The good Christian must go among the poor, as had Christ, lifting up even the most degraded by providing them personal contact with superior natures. The economic reformer's calling was to, quote, redeem all our social relations, Ely declared, by establishing an earthly kingdom of righteousness. The AEA economists were young. Ely was 31 years old at the time of the AEA's founding. Woodrow Wilson, a recent graduate student of Ely's, was 28 and had just begun his academic career at Bryn Mawr College. Edward W. Bemis, another newly minted Ely student, was 25, then at Amherst College. Edwin R.A. Sleegman, freshly appointed at Columbia College, was 24. Among the senior charter members, John Bates Clark was, at 38, the oldest by 4 years. In redirecting American Protestantism from saving souls to saving society, the social gospelers enlarged and transformed the idea of Christian redemption. John R. Commons, an Ely protege who rose to the front ranks of progressive economics, affirmed the social gospel view that society was the proper object of redemption. Just as salvation was increasingly socialized, so too was sin. Edward A. Ross, like Commons, was a student of Ely's at Johns Hopkins, who became a leading public intellectual of American progressivism. Ross's Sin and Society summarized the view that sin was no longer a matter of inborn immortality. Sin, Ross wrote, was social in cause. Redeeming America required more than a reformed church. Social gospelers built an impressive network of voluntary agencies to encourage Christian betterment. Christian youth associations, Christian summer camps, the Salvation Army, immigrant settlement houses, and a host of other organizations intended to redeem the impressionable, the fallen, and the newly arrived. Ultimately, however, the social gospel economists, like all progressives, turned to the state. Arthur Latham Perry had seen the hand of God in the way free market exchange benefited all. The social gospel economists who opposed free markets but not divine purpose relocated him to the state. Quote, God works through the state, Ely professed, more so than through any other institution, including, he implied, the church. Commons told his Christian audiences that the state was the greatest power for good that existed among men and women. The AEA's intellectual leaders, Henry Carter Adams, John Bates Clark, and Simon Nelson Patton, were not quite as outspoken as Ely and Commons. But they, too, understood economic reform as a method of redeeming American economic and political life. So, to go on, Ely was very instrumental in Wisconsin as well. But first, just a little bit more on like the actual the relationship between progressivism and the state and science. So progressives left and right, this is page 38. Historians ordinarily characterize such AALL stalwarts as Irving Fisher, Henry Farnham, and Frank Taussig as conservatives, which is adequate as a first approximation. None of them were evangelical firebrands like their colleagues Ely, Commons, and Henderson, and they were situated in the colonial-era colleges Harvard and Yale, which stood at one remove from the hubs of economic reform. Sorry, it's dark here. I should have gotten my lighting more correct. And they were situated in the colonial-era colleges Harvard and Yale, which stood at one remove from the hubs of economic reform at Johns Hopkins, Wisconsin, Columbia, and Pennsylvania. But these men were also labor legislation activists, entirely committed to the idea, as Fisher put it, that, quote, not only can society be reformed, but to do so is the principal service of economic and social sciences. Farnham, heir to the New Haven Railroad fortune, funded the AALL out of his own pocket in its early years. And this is important here. I think you'll find this interesting. The AALL reminds us that progressivism was first and foremost an attitude about the proper relationship of science and its bearer, the scientific expert, to the state, and of the state to the economy and polity. University certified experts advised or served the administrative state and the fourth branch of government, which investigated and regulated economic life in the name of an expert identified common good. But, quote, progressive is a political term, and political historians tend to an ideological lens. Ideology is a useful tool of taxonomy, but when it is reduced to one dimension, it is the enemy of nuance. So I don't know if he kind of does some apologetics to it, but I think I would argue that you can draw a direct ideological parallel from the progressive era and this eugenics agenda to what's currently happening right now. This entire idea of the administrative state is the liberal mindset. Not saying it's unique to liberals, because conservatives also feel this way. Again, conservatism in many respects is progressivism driving the speed limit. But I digress. So he writes on page 40 in a section called Building the Fourth Branch in Wisconsin. The progressive economists established a beachhead in the universities by 1900 and an AALL-type think tank soon after. The universities applied their scientific bona fides, I've heard it pronounced too, and the think tanks provide them a shelter for advocacy that more or less safeguarded their claim to scientific objectivity. Both institutions would provide essential and permanent homes for American economists. But the big prize was government. Professors and think tankers might move elite opinion some, but suasion might only go so far. But suasion went only so far. Government compulsion promised economic reform, that was faster and further reaching. The first prototype of American administrative government was built in Wisconsin. Governor Robert La Follette, the Republican progressive, empowered the University of Wisconsin faculty and unleashed them on the state. By 1908, all the economists in 1/6 of the university's entire faculty held appointments on Wisconsin government commissions, including Charles Van Hees, the university president. Charles Van Hees. Commons, whom Ely had recruited to Madison in 1904, traveled the street connecting the university and the state capitol so regularly he wore a groove into it. But Commons and his allies got legislation that established regulatory commissions, restricted working hours, fixed minimum wages, regulated utilities, and compensated industrial accident victims. By 1912, 2 books extolling the Wisconsin idea had been published: Frederick W. Howe's Wisconsin, An Experiment in Democracy, and Charles McCarthy's The Wisconsin Idea. Howe had been a student of Ely's at Johns Hopkins, receiving his PhD in 1892. The same year, Ely left Baltimore to direct Wisconsin's freshly founded School of Economics, Political Science, and History. Howe described Wisconsin as a scientific laboratory of reform. Wisconsin, he said, was already the most efficient commonwealth in the United States, a model for America, just as Germany was for the world. Germany was the world's most advanced scientific state because it had been the first to call in the experts, but Wisconsin was not far behind. McCarthy's account proposed that German heredity was also at work. Wisconsin was a, quote, German state, because so many Wisconsinites were of Teutonic stock, 48ers and their descendants. The Wisconsin idea breathlessly described Richard T. Ely as a pupil of German professors who returned from Germany with German political ideas to teach German-inspired economics at a German university, the University of Wisconsin. In the German state of Wisconsin, where the young men he most inspired were, yes, of German stock. Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote a flattering introduction to McCarthy's book, was unfazed, perhaps because he was in search of votes, or perhaps because he himself had imbibed a large draught of Teutonism in his graduate student days at Columbia. As we shall see again in Chapter 7, he says, Germany could make certain American progressives weak in the knees. Here was a state that truly understood the value of ideas, John Dewey observed in 1915. Germany had arranged its educational administrative agencies to ensure that scientific ideas informed practical affairs. German higher education, Dewey said, was, quote, really not just nominally under the control of the state. So we see all these connections, and the connection between, a lot has been said in this, like by John Taylor Gatto, and Richard Grove has done a lot of work on the Prussian schooling system and how it influenced the United States, while Wisconsin, in a way, served as that conduit at the time for these ideas to come into the United States. So we're going to take a little look at a PBS interview, but this is where it really kind of bridges over to what we're talking about. So on page 110, he says, in 1911, Governor Woodrow Wilson signed New Jersey's forcible sterilization legislation, which targeted, quote, the hopelessly defective in criminal classes. Inspired by the slogan, quote, sterilization or racial disaster, Wisconsin passed its forcible sterilization law in 1913 with the support of the University of Wisconsin's most influential scholars, among them President Charles Van Hees and Edward A. Ross. When Charles McCarthy of the Wisconsin Legislative Reference Library queried Ross on the merits of forcible sterilization, Ross pulled no punches. He said, quote, I'm entirely in favor of it. Ross said, and, quote, the objections to it are essentially sentimental and will not bear inspection. Ross assured McCarthy that involuntary sterilization was, quote, not nearly so terrible as hanging a man, and the chances of sterilizing the fit are not nearly so great as are the chances of hanging the innocent. By the first 3 decades of the 20th century, eugenic ideas were politically influential, culturally fashionable, and scientifically mainstream. The elite sprinkled their conversations with eugenic concerns to signal their au courant high-mindedness. As Ross put it, interest in eugenics was almost, quote, a perfect index of one's breadth of outlook and unselfish concern for the future of our race. The appalling death toll of the First World War quickened eugenic fears, Ross voicing a sentiment held by many, bemoaned the, quote, immeasurable calamity that has befallen the white race. Well, I don't think that's the best reason to oppose World War I. I don't know if he's trying to link the anti-war movement with essentially eugenics or anything like that. But anyways, this is a great book. I think that you have to, I know that he gave a lecture. So there's a lecture on YouTube that I'll try and put into the show notes where you can kind of get his take on it and get this in a nutshell without reading the book. But I would definitely, I would support this as being a good reference because, again, I said he kind of makes the author, Thomas E. Leonard, he tries to avoid the linking the progressive agenda with the modern progressive agenda with these eugenic ideas. So now to kind of bring this a little bit more full circle, I want to, I found an interview on PBS Wisconsin, an interview with a graduate student from Milwaukee who did a large featured article about the Northern Center. And I think that she introduces it very well. Before the segment I'm about to play, and I'll play it, and for those of you just listening to the audio version, I'm going to be kind of showing the colony on Google Maps as she's talking, just to fill up the visual space. But of course, she kind of bemoans the oil barons, and I think that some libertarians have supported the oil barons in the way of, I understand billionaire, like there's the libertarian argument about oil, big corporations providing cheap services and goods and stuff. And I think that's a whole another conversation to have. But essentially, it seems like she connects the capitalist mindset to eugenics in a way when I don't think that's necessarily something that's warranted or supported by the historical record. But I digress. So here's that interview. And we'll be jumping around just a little bit, but again, I'll be showing some of the visuals from the colony itself.
And we just produce more of our kind. And that's why more of our kind get richer and richer and get more affluence while the poor get poorer, And so that was a really good rationalization for them.
So let's start with Indiana and this law
Yes.
in 1907. What was the purpose of it?
The purpose was to curtail the unfits. And now with eugenics laws, there wasn't like a federal eugenics laws except for immigration. And so it depended on the states and what the doctors, the legislatures believed, what they perceived, or what they got out of the eugenic theory. And so for Indiana, it was they focused more on the mental defectives, the criminals. Some states didn't. They didn't focus on the criminals. They just who they deemed as mental defectives. And usually, that's the people who are dependent on the states, who got aid from the states, financial support, welfare, the welfare recipients, and the promiscuous people. People who broke like societal transgressions.
Okay, so again, there seem to be sort of two things going on. One of them has to do with behavior.
Yes.
And the other has to do with what we call, defects or, physiological defects. So in this law in Indiana, what are they actually doing to implement it?
They who they targeted were people, the inmates in the state institutions who were diagnosed as insane or having a mental defect. They just call them mental defectives. And for women, like a sexual transgression, they were like a prostitute, or they just had illegitimate children. So there's that sexual transgression, that societal transgression.
Well, they have a whole set of state prisons, but they're not going there. And they're not assuming that because somebody is a criminal and incarcerated, that they would be subject to eugenics. Just the the more those considered to be mentally defective somehow.
Yeah. With Indiana, I'm not sure. What I remember is that I think it was like in the prisons, they would go to the prisons and examine some of the prisoners and see if they were deemed mental defectives, and then they would transfer them over to the state institutions.
So now when we get to a nice progressive enlightened state like Wisconsin in 1913, how did that compare in terms of its implementation of eugenics laws?
Well, with Indiana's passing the first eugenic sterilization law, then other states followed. And so Wisconsin just, picked up on that trail. And it's like, we should have a law too. And the person who very much wanted a passage of a eugenic sterilization law was Dr. Alfred Wilmarth. He was the first superintendent for the Wisconsin Home for the Feebleminded, which that was the name of now is the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled.
And what did the law actually say in Wisconsin?
It's any mental defective or epileptic inmates in the institution, they can undergo the operation.
And they can undergo.
Well, they should.
Who makes the decision, and is there any kind of a safety valve for that?
Well, what happened was when the law passed, the state department that oversaw that whole sterilization program was the State Board of Control. And so the State Board of Control, along with the superintendent, Dr. Wilmarth, would compile the list of potential sterilization candidates. And what they did was, of course, look at each case file, but also their family backgrounds. And so they would research their family backgrounds and see if there was any relatives or family members who were either in other state institutions or just a history of welfare, receiving welfare from the state, criminality.
Did this individual, whether it was a prostitute just picked up last week or an epileptic who might have been institutionalized for a year, have any kind of say or choice in this? Or did this group of experts just make the decision and there was no recourse?
Well, they had very little say in it, of course. Being for themselves, being in a state institution, obviously they couldn't afford a private institution. And so they had very little legal recourse. And part of their procedures is once a person was a candidate for sterilization, they would send a notice to a family member, a relative, or their guardian. And if they don't get any notification back, that was considered consent.
Silence is consent.
Yes. And and if there was a refusal of their ward or their daughter or son to get a sterilization, then they were an inmate of the institution indefinitely.
Oh, so this sterilization was assumed to be then kind of a credential for getting freed of the institution.
Yes,
for
for discharge or parole, very much so. So there's that coercion there.
And what do we know about Dr. Wilmarth? Was his motive well-founded, do you think? Because there were a lot of people around at this time, pseudo-experts, who did profit from doing one kind of surgery or another on people.
Well, back then, reputable doctors like Dr. Wilmarth were very much respected in their addresses to medical societies, to legislatures, to women's clubs, to other social clubs. They were believed. They were trusted. They would throw out the statistical numbers. Back then, in regards to eugenics, they weren't under the scrutiny like we are now with research. And so they were readily believed. And maybe in the way they wanted to believe that.
It was a time, of course, of authority figures,
Yes.
really right on through into the 50s, probably, that if somebody was purportedly an expert in a field,
yes,
he or she was credible.
Yes.
That's a kind of this instant credibility we saw, of course, in advertising for years.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Wilmarth, then he have I want to say confederate, but that's not quite the right word, but he had adherents, he had assistants in this crusade for eugenics.
Oh, yes. He was the chief supporter of it. I know that there were at UW-Madison, or the Wisconsin State College, I think it was, or the university back then, here in Madison, there were professors who supported eugenics, like E.A. Ross and Charles Van Nuys. So very much in the intellectual circles.
So actually, the president of the university, Van Nuys,
yes,
supported eugenics.
Yes.
Well, I think there was also, wasn't there a presidential candidate who
Theodore
supported
Roosevelt, yes.
Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Yes. It's surprising. Even Helen Keller.
Really?
Yes, she supported eugenics. Surprisingly or shockingly, she supported eugenical euthanasia of mentally challenged babies.
That's yes. Quite a surprise.
So, and also feminists too, and Marie Stopes, and I think a local suffragist, Ada James,
were in favor of eugenics.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating how it kind of splits out these various factions that you would think might be antithetical to each other.
They do.
Even through the 20th
I think it's really
century.
funny what they do here, because they kind of they grapple with this idea that the progressive mindset, like all of these progressive heroes that they just rattled off, were in favor of eugenics, and they kind of grapple with it. And you see a little bit of cognitive dissonance there, where they're trying to pull it apart. And I kind of messed up with the pausing there, so I'm just going to replay that last little bit. You can kind of see the cognitive dissonance here. It's worth replaying.
Yeah, and also feminists too, and Marie Stopes, and I think a local suffragist, Ada James,
were in favor of eugenics.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating how it kind of splits out these various factions that you would think might be antithetical to each other.
Yes, even through the 20th century, these people were in the same circles, the same similar organizations, the same organizations. So they talked to each other frequently, probably about eugenics and sterilization, and they had connections to the legislatures. So they had that influence and power. And so if they're going to believe this eugenic theory and say, sterilization, that is a good idea, they can do something with that.
Now, I shouldn't have to really belabor. I think the connections to the present day should be pretty apparent throughout that. I think that was like a, 7 or 8 minute little segment that I played there. But the connections here, at one point he's saying, and this was recorded before COVID-19 happened, but he was saying that, this was really like a time of trusting the experts and really believing in the experts, wasn't it? And all these things about all these progressive leaders and heroes that you are taught and brainwashed about in public school, all these people that they laud and put on such a high pedestal, they're all eugenicists. And then he's trying to grapple with that whole idea that all of these progressive heroes that we've lionized for so long have been rabid eugenicists. I think it's really interesting to see that at play.
They go out.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this northern colony was where?
In Chippewa Falls.
Chippewa Falls. Mm-hmm. And it was established when?
1897. Very much an isolated part of Wisconsin. It still is.
I find that really funny. What she says is that Chippewa is a very isolated part of Wisconsin. It's just funny because I don't think that's true. But spoken like a true person from Milwaukee, that's what it is. So I'm gonna keep playing anyways.
I did visit there several years ago, and some of the old buildings are still standing. But it was very much a colony. It was very much its own village and isolated from the world. But that was the attitude towards developmentally disabled people at the time: out of sight, out of mind.
And just to skip ahead briefly, though,
Sure.
so the focus of it, the Northern Colony, has changed, obviously, from eugenics to some other form of transition into society.
Yes. In contemporary times now, they take on more severe physically disabled clients. Yes.
Let's look at the kind of the social fabric that was being addressed by these eugenic laws in Wisconsin in the 19-teens. We talk about people who are sexually promiscuous, primarily women.
Yes.
Was the concern because they were the ones who would be having children, but was there a male component to this concern also?
Well, the male component was that they had more rights. They could probably assert themselves more in getting legal protection instead of the woman. The most vulnerable back at that time was the sexually promiscuous woman who would fall out of favor of society. And so they were very much more vulnerable to sterilization.
I suppose harder to prove promiscuity with the man anyway, if he doesn't stick around.
Yes, yes.
We have here a party scene. This is, I believe, Milwaukee, 1914.
Yes.
And would this group of people be candidates for the kind of eugenics we've been talking about?
Yes.
And why would that be?
I remember one case in particular where a woman was admitted to the Northern Colony partly because she was caught in a saloon with a man. And you picture a woman in this dance hall back then, and they wouldn't be looked at as very pious women,
right?
And so in that particular county, I think that was south of Milwaukee in Racine County, she was arrested and she was incarcerated at the Northern Colony.
Oh, okay. What was she arrested for?
She was caught with a man in a saloon, and that's she had
children necessarily out of wedlock.
As far as I
selling sex.
No, but back then in a saloon or a dance hall, that was very much where people saw women being confronted with their own downfall, selling themselves. And so,
or giving themselves away.
Right. And so being caught with a man in a saloon, that could have went both ways there, prostitution or just giving oneself away.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was considered kind of preemptive in this case, which makes you wonder a little bit about how preemptive they could get with a eugenics law. Somebody's just in a situation where they might have this downfall.
Oh yeah. And they might have the downfall or they committed it. I remember case studies where there was one woman who was admitted and then sterilized. She was caught for prostitution. Women who had illegitimate children. And also the family history. They had family members who were committed or receiving welfare from the state. These were, and for some of these women, they were assaulted, or raped, or they were incarcerated. Well, the men may have gotten parole or may have gotten jail time, but then sooner or later they would be released.
Which is reason why I'm kind of amazed that the suffragists would support these laws, because they're so unfair.
Yes, and it's also, one of my professors said that class trumps gender. And these women, these suffragists, and other women too, they were from the upper and middle to upper classes. And so they supported eugenics too, even though they were of the same gender. It's like, well, I'm keeping my piety. Why aren't they? Or, something like that.
Yes.
They must be defective. That was the attitude. Right. They must be defective. Why would you give yourself away? Why would you prostitute? There's something wrong mentally with you.
And so something as simple as one instance of being apprehended in a saloon with a man would get an individual into this northern colony automatically subject to sterilization?
Well, and unfortunately, there was women from other institutions who were transferred to the northern colony to get sterilized. So some of these women were in institutions for a number of years. Lived in their young lives an institutionalized life, and with that, they have to go before the judge because the judge can. They're the only ones who can order their incarceration.
Right.
And so they can go before the judge and have, the witnesses come forward and, she did this, she did that. And according to where she was in her community, her status, maybe she was a woman of bad repute, that the judge can, and it depended on the judge on whether or not they knew of this program. And probably most of them did. Women were incarcerated or admitted from all over the state. So it's like, this is where you need to be. I'm going to send you to the northern colony. So
let's follow this. And it's not hypothetical, but we don't necessarily know everything about her subsequent history.
Yeah.
But this woman arrested for being in a saloon with a man.
Right.
So we'll say 1914 or so, and sentenced to incarceration by a judge. And then somebody decides that she should go to the northern colony.
Right. And so she's transferred to the northern colony from probably the county jail. And once she is there, they do examine her. They are given an intelligence test. And then they're put into or placed into a cottage. And then what happens then if they are a candidate for sterilization, how that's determined is the Sterilization Committee. And that is made up of the superintendents, the alienist, which was, now we call him a psychiatrist.
Alienist.
And yes, and a medical doctor. And so they would look at the case and probably interview her. And so for a woman to go before a judge and having this exposed or whatever, and then having this shame, this past coming up again for her, and then losing one's fertility. It was just what the women went through.
But she would have to go through the sterilization in order to get out of the colony, in order to be released.
Yes. And so,
it kind of reminds me of the way the Humane Society is today. But then, how long would she be in this colony typically, sterilized or otherwise?
The average time, I did calculate the average time and it was, I think it was 5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years.
Yes. And
whether she'd been sterilized or not.
Well,
how did that work?
The thing is, the average age of sterilization was 21 years old for a woman, and so they could be sterilized, and that was in the admission books that I examined. They would have the date of the sterilization, and then they would stay for a period of time and then be paroled or discharged, or some of them escaped, and then. So many years later, it could be that someone just enters into that admission book discharged from the State Board of Control. So whether that was an actual discharge or they just wrote it in just to close the case, who knows?
What was the actual sterilization procedure? We have, this operating room scene here.
Yes.
What did they actually do?
It was called salpingectomy.
Salpingectomy.
Yes. and that was the cutting of the fallopian tubes, I believe it was. Yes, that was the main method.
And it would have been irreversible.
Right.
Well, okay, so 5 to 10 years in this northern colony.
Yes.
Well, and was it, there was a mix of genders at this colony? Or
yes, it was. It was, for the most part, an equal number of men and an equul number of women who were at the colony.
All right, so what did they do for their 5 to 10 years?
Well, they... they did according to what society would have men and women do. Men were in the workshop, and they would be trained to do woodwork, or trained to repair shoes, or work in agricultural, because they had their own farm there too at the institution, and so they would be doing that. And so the women would be in home domesticity, where they would be trained to wait tables, or they would be trained to wash dishes and to cook, to sew.
Regardless of what their profession
right.
may have been before they went in, they were just kind of funneled through this sort of job training program.
Yes. Especially that really took off in the 1920s with Dr. Beyer. He very much believed in that type of rehabilitation.
Do we have a sense of like any case studies in terms of how these people did after they were released from the northern colony? I mean, is this something that they would have on their resume, that would make it perhaps more difficult for them to get employment?
I think they were placed, I have read that they were placed in different areas of employment, but very much once they were paroled or discharged, they didn't check up on them. They didn't keep track with them. They didn't. And throughout this research, I found very little voice on account of the inmates' part.
It really was.
Yeah, so there's a little bit more to this, and I'll put a link in the show notes page if you want to listen to the rest. But I did find it very interesting. And basically, what else she says is that, this practice, sterilizations, really continued until the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, it was something that went on for quite a long period of time. And it seemed like it was all for naught because no one checked in on these people. Like she said, that no one really took statistics, or they didn't do any looking at the gene pool to see if there was any net benefit to society or anything like this. And it's just kind of like, well, why did we do this? Why did we do this? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wishlist there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribestar button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to Rokfin.com, ROKFIN. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute. Just a whole bunch of people. Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack /Substack. So you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show. So the Northern Center wasn't the only place in Wisconsin that they did this. There was also the Southern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled. And this was established a little bit later in 1916. And there's a little bit more info here. But when the interview was playing, I also went through and I scrolled through a list of all the names of the people who had been there that were on record. So you can see the immense amount of people. I was scrolling for a while, and I think this is just to the census. But here on this website, we get a little bit of a look at the number of people who were sterilized there. And according to this source, it was a total of 1,823 people on record who were sterilized. Of course, whom were sterilized, 70% were women and 99.5% were deemed mentally deficient. Wisconsin was 11th in the nation for the total number of sterilizations performed. So the state passed the first law, as we said, in 1913, but sterilizations did not occur until 1915, when the first 76 were conducted at the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled. Legal sterilizations continued in Wisconsin until 1963. So here was the pattern. Let's see. Cumulative sterilizations in Wisconsin. So they really continue. Let's see. So yeah, 1963, it kind of stays the same until 1983. While a relatively small number of people were sterilized through the late 20s, the number of sterilizations increased in the 1930s and remained high until the end of World War II. For this period, the average number of sterilizations was about 80 per year. There were approximately 3 sterilizations per 100,000 people per year. So I also wanted to show a little bit of the actual article that she wrote about this. And that's the lady being interviewed. Her name is Phyllis Reski. And the article that she wrote is entitled "Policing the Wayward Woman, Eugenics in Wisconsin's Involuntary Sterilization Program." So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think I just wanted to give, here's a story that she puts on the first page. So this is her article. In 1921, Eliza Warren was arrested in Madison, Wisconsin for prostitution. She appeared before the Supreme Court of Dane County and was convicted of the charge. Instead of jail or probation, the judge ordered her committed to a state institution in Chippewa Falls referred to as the Wisconsin Home for the Feebleminded, or the Northern Colony. Upon her arrival at the institution, Eliza confessed to admission personnel that her husband brought men home to her for sexual relations and that she had been a prostitute prior to her marriage. She also admitted to having syphilis. The admissions staff judged her to be, quote, defective in morals and, quote, delinquent in her ability to reason. She was paroled to her father 3 years later and was discharged by the Wisconsin State Board of Control in 1926. Before her release, an operation was performed on her to make sure she produced no more of her kind. Pretty sick stuff. Eliza's experience was the result of the involuntary sterilization program that existed in Wisconsin for over half of the 20th century. The program was the result of a socio-scientific movement called Eugenics, the pseudoscience of fit individuals breeding better humans, and the prevention of the unfit from reproducing. The preferred methods used to achieve this end for most eugenicists and eugenic supporters were segregation and sterilization. So she also talks about this, and then the marriage laws as well, how there were marriage laws where you had to like apply, and this is why I got so pissed off when my wife and I got married. We had to apply for the marriage license, and I remember just being so irritated because I knew what the original intent of that was. Two women. Here's a picture for those of you just listening. These are two women posed next to gambling machines at Buddy's place in the township of Rib Mountain, which is kind of in north central Wisconsin by Wausau. February 27th, 1942. The bar operated as a house of prostitution. So, and then here's another picture of a place in Milwaukee, a dance hall. So the terms fit and unfit were linked to the societal norms and standards at the turn of the 20th century. As Eliza's experience attests, socioeconomic factors such as gender and class played significant roles in determining who advocated for the programs and who became victims. While most eugenic debate and legislation took place at the state level, some restrictive national immigration laws shared the philosophy of keeping the unfit from coming to America. So champions of eugenic policies were often scientists, politicians, physicians, and intellectuals, many of whom were at the forefront of the progressive movement. Supporters included Alexander Graham Bell and Teddy Roosevelt, as well as University of Wisconsin professor Edward A. Ross and University president Charles Van Hise. Middle and upper class women also supported the eugenics movement. Teachers, reformers, social workers, and club members, including Margaret Sanger, Marie Stopes, and Wisconsin suffragist Ada James. Eugenics advocates most often targeted people they deemed mentally ill or mentally deficient for sterilization. Most of the people given these labels were from the lower class, eligible for state welfare, or those who broke society's rules of morality, including criminals and those considered sexually promiscuous. For the upper tiers of society, eugenics changed the cliche like breeds like from a judgment to a scientific theory. They believed that the lower classes were outpopulating the upper classes. Fearing class and economic destruction, they wanted men and women of similar morals, work ethic, and mental and physical health to prevail, and transgressors and dependents on the state to stop reproducing. Eugenics theories and programs permitted proponents to express these beliefs and endorse sterilization laws without being shunned by their peers. So one of the things that Corbett talks about, specifically kind of in his Big Oil series, talking about how this did not go away, is that this whole eugenics mindset didn't go away. And I think a big part of it was the stigma from World War II and the Nazi mindset. The Nazis saying that this kind of came from the United States, that these ideas percolated most in the United States and developed, and that the Germans kind of took the ideas and ran with it. But Corbett in his Big Oil series talks about how the eugenics movement didn't really go away. It just transformed into the environmentalist movement, and that all of the people, all the oil barons and the corporations and the big families, your Morgans, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, they put all their effort and energy into a new swindle. It's the climate change swindle. And if you peer closely at the climate change agenda, you will find this eugenics ideology and some of the same faces and the same people behind it. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to do an episode on this, kind of a deep dive, was to highlight that the COVID agenda, the eugenics agenda, and the climate change agenda are very, very interrelated. They have plans on, what backstops it is the belief in the omnipotent state, the belief that the state is the means by which we change and model society. And all of these things should be so apparent to the listeners. The taking science and taking experts and creating these religious positions for them to be exalted. And the guy in the interview said it, is that, this really was a time where we took experts and put them on a pedestal and took them at their word. And the author of this article was talking about how the experts would get up and they would give their speeches at all these organizations and for the public, and the public would buy into it because the expert and the scientist would come up and they would talk about all of these statistics and the science that they did, and that it was all just bunk, and it was dressed up in a lab coat. And that's why people took it very seriously, and it was some of the most influential and powerful people in society that took it so seriously. So just after the turn of the century, several states adopted eugenic laws, hoping that both their economics and human gene pools would improve if the undesirables were prevented from procreating. Indiana passed their law. 1907, the law called for the compulsory sterilization of any idiot, imbecile, rapist, or confirmed criminal committed to the state institutions. After passage of the Indiana law, 32 states established sterilization laws. Wisconsin passed its involuntary sterilization law in 1913. So there were court cases like Buck v. Bell that was upheld by the Supreme Court. I've talked about that on this show. Doctors in Wisconsin performed more sterilizations than before because of Buck v. Bell, yet the increase was not enough to attract a great deal of public and legislative attention until 1965. The state administered the law conservatively to prevent it from being legally challenged and to protect the physicians and hospital and institution superintendents from liability. And there was a study in Wisconsin. Maybe it wasn't Wisconsin. I think, it's an Indiana family, the Jukes. And this study was a large part of what created and justified the eugenicist mindset. So you see that on screen there. So they talk here about the Northern Colony, the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded. Dr. Alfred A. Wilmarth, first superintendent. So in total, over 60,000 people were sterilized in the U.S. California ranked first in the total number of procedures at over 20,000 operations performed, with an equal number of men and women. And North Carolina ranked third in sterilizations performed. Over 7,600 men and women were sterilized. Officials in North Carolina, in contrast with California, deemed mentally deficient the majority of people sterilized, and a minority was people that were labeled mentally ill. The goals of Wisconsin's eugenics laws were similar to those of other states. Involuntary sterilization would prevent the proliferation of defective people and curb the economic threat more dependence posed to the state. Many supporters of eugenics laws believe the most straightforward way to achieve these goals was sterilization of the most easily identifiable segment of the unfit population, the impoverished, sexually wayward women. Armed with an active eugenics program solution, those in authority were more willing to pass social and legal judgment on women like Eliza Warren. As a result, many women were committed to the Northern Colony and sterilized with little means for legal protection. Then she talks a bit more about how the Juke study helped to support and undergird the passage of these eugenics policies in Wisconsin and other states. She says in the early 1980s, the members of the Wisconsin Conference of Charities and Corrections adopted the principles of the eugenic movement, citing the family studies of the Jukes and the tribe of Ishmael. They expressed concern that the defective class posed an economic and social burden on society and discussed ways in which the procreation of more defectives could be prevented. Dugdale claimed that environment played a role in the Jukes' lifestyle and habits. He argued that a change of environment was the correction needed for personal improvement, and stressed education as the main method of change. Despite these assertions, professionals continued to focus on the belief that defective genes were the root cause of problems that burdened society. The WCCC supported the hereditary claim and affirmed eugenic doctrines. Here's some good language for you. The WCCC, along with the State Teachers Association, State Medical Society, Board of Health, and Federation of Women's Organizations, lobbied for the creation of a custodial institution. In 1895, the state legislature passed a law establishing the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded in Chippewa Falls. Under the supervision of the Wisconsin State Board of Control, the WHF, Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded, opened in the summer of 1897. In the same year, the Wisconsin legislature passed and enacted a law that called for the arrest and confinement of, quote, vicious, feeble-minded persons. People given this label by the WSBC were often most epileptics and idiots considered, quote, dangerous because of their, quote, vicious and demoralizing acts or tendencies, or feeble-minded women of childbearing age determined to be, quote, a menace to society. And then I think a parallel here is, of course, all these institutions getting behind these heinous policies. And I mean, I can make a direct comparison to COVID-19, the World Health Organization, the CDC, the FDA, all these government organizations that are getting behind this, the officials that are propagating this narrative. Well, in the progressive era, these were the officials propagating it. All of these organizations, the State Teachers Association, the State Medical Society. I mean, that's akin to the American Medical Association. Board of Health, state level, of course, different, but the Board of Health and the Federation of Women's Organizations lobbied for the creation of this institution. And one thing that Will Marth did, the superintendent, he took this concept to Wisconsin when he was appointed superintendent. In his published writings and addresses to Wisconsin physicians and legislatures, Will Marth described the moral imbecile and argued that the procreation of these individuals needed to be stopped. He thought that an insufficient amount of any one of these mental capabilities indicated mental weakness as well. Mental deficiency, he declared, was a permanent and inherited trait. Because of this perceived permanency, he thought that people so defined could never support themselves. He concluded that they would depend on the state and become a social and financial burden. He also claimed that the insane and epileptics suffered from moral imbecility. Will Marth emphasized inheritance, permanency, and cost to society in order to make a strong argument for sterilization. And people believed it. People bought it. So there were some who opposed it. However, the former president, again, we were talking about the former president of UW-Madison, Charles Van Hise, believed that sterilization was the, quote, proper method to prevent the defectives from propagating. E.A. Ross, professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, was also a strong eugenics advocate and supported the legislative measure. So the Catholic Church steps up, says, as Archbishop Sebastian G. Messmer of Milwaukee said, quote, it interferes with personal independence and individual liberty. Charles B. Davenport, a well-known eugenicist from New York, opposed sterilization legislation. Oh, so there's some, it's good to see this nuance. It's not just all eugenicists propagating the sterilization narrative. It just seems like the prevailing ones in a great many of them, but not all. This eugenicist, Charles B. Davenport, believed more research into the effects of sterilization was needed. Victor L. Berger, a prominent socialist and editor of the newspaper The Milwaukee Leader, didn't support the law because he believed that vice, pauperism, and the like were caused by the competitive capitalistic system and not by hereditary defects. Such notable opponents and arguments notwithstanding, the sterilization bill was passed and signed into law in the summer of 1913 by progressive governor Francis McGovern. So it allows the Wisconsin State Board of Control to put all this in place. And they did it through the surgical procedures that we heard about in the interview beforehand. So we already went over all the numbers of the people who were sterilized at the Northern Center. And you can see some of the newspaper clippings, the mainstream debate. So, all right, well, I wanted to keep this to around an hour, but one of the things that I had done, I alluded to, I went there just the other night. And I wanted to share some of the videos that I took when I was there because it was really creepy, and I'm sure that the place is haunted. But all of the buildings are still up there, and like I said, it's publicly accessible. Of course I didn't go into the buildings, and I'm sure that some people have gone into the buildings, but I haven't been able to find any video from people going into the buildings. But I thought it was interesting. So it was a really kind of creepy night. And so, oops. Here we go. Here was a video that I took from my car. I couldn't get the lighting right, so just kind of bear with me here, but just do a little bit of the audio. So I kind of did the Google Maps of this building, so you can see it on Google Maps kind of in the daylight. But this was one of the cabins. I think they were calling it the cabin building. So you can see kind of that all the windows are boarded up. The front door is boarded up, and it doesn't look like they're really doing anything with it. And so I wanted to get kind of a drive-by on video, and the camera that I used to record my episodes, I totally forgot to bring with me, so I used my phone, which wasn't a great substitute. But you can see that some of the buildings are still being used there, and so this was the day after Christmas that I drove through. And so it wasn't really busy popping or anything like that. And my windshield was dirty, so I held the phone outside the window. But this is one of the buildings you can clearly see from the picture that we put up earlier. You can see the old picture. You can see that same spot. Let's see. You can see it in the video here. Around 22 minutes. This building right here is the same building.
I did visit there several.
I'm pretty sure it's the same building because you can see the walk-up right there. And on my video, you can see right there. Might not be the same one, but you can see the kind of the entry place right there. So let's see, I think I included, here's a picture that I took of one of the buildings. There's like this night picture mode on my camera that was able to absorb a lot of the light. And I was half expecting to see like a face peeking out of one of the windows there. But it's pretty creepy, I mean, especially at night when I went. So you can see, the fence is up just to keep people out. Here's another one of the buildings. And this was one of the buildings in kind of a courtyard. And there's another building on the left-hand side and another building on the right-hand side. It seemed like it was maybe like the main mall of the facility. And there was an administrative building that I took a look at kind of at the end of when I was doing the visuals for the interview. This one here. I didn't drive past this one. When I was there at night, everything looks kind of different and I just didn't see it. There's a lot of, like if you look, there's a lot of kind of windy roads here. So kind of a creepy looking view in the headlights here. Another video I kind of got out. It's a little blurry, but I got out. I just kind of walked up to the front. I wasn't really brave enough to go up to the door and take a peek inside, but I really wonder what it looks like in there. And I thought maybe there'd be some urban explorers who had kind of broken in, but definitely would be criminal trespassing. I wasn't about to do that. So yeah, but that's it. So it was really interesting to kind of get to the bottom of this thing. Like, in a way, it was like an urban legend. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary Cropsey or something like that. To grow up to something and be seeing it for your whole life and not really being taught the history of it. And the history is just kind of a shameful history. And like I said, if you go now and see the facility, this is the type of thing that they're doing there. They're working with folks with disabilities, and they have CNA courses and stuff there. And I'm sure it's a fine service, and they take care of their clients. I would really hope, and I have no evidence to the contrary. But so that's kind of what it looks like now. Is there some buildings that are still being used there? So yeah, but I think one of my main messages from this is drawing the parallels between the eugenics era, the terrible things that happened there, drawing the parallel between that and, if you watch Corbett's Big Oil series and the other work that he's done, tying the eugenics movement to the new climate change agenda, and then the parallels between the eugenics and the worshiping of experts and all of those things to what we're going through now with COVID-19 and that agenda. I think it's just food for thought, something to think of. And I would argue that these are intimately connected. This mindset, the intellectual tradition behind progressivism, and the eugenics movement, and all of those hallmarks being directly translatable to the modern progressive movement and the COVID-19 agenda. And of course, hiding behind this all is the depopulation agenda and the idea that there's way too many people on the earth, and that the earth is cannon fodder. And a lot of the heavy lifting for that, if that's a jump that you just haven't made or haven't explored, all the heavy lifting there is done in Corbett's Big Oil series. So if you go to corbettreport.com/big oil, you'll find those dots connected. And he does it much better than I can. So I would direct everyone to check out. But he also ties in Bill Gates and his feature on who is Bill Gates. He did a series on that, Corbett did, where he ties, again, this world depopulation agenda, reducing the world's population to a much, much smaller size, to the eugenics movement, and to of course, Bill Gates, but to talking about the COVID-19 agenda and how those things are interrelated. So to explore these and to establish those connections, I think is really important and something that is definitely food for thought. It would be very naive to think that these ideas just went away, in that they're not still being practiced out there by the elite in society and the people, the money interests and the special interests that are behind all of the policies that we are seeing today. So that about does it for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. Definitely, I thought it was very interesting, so I hope you did too. So go to libertyweekly.net/197 for the show notes page, and we will be back next week with another episode. Peace.